Okay, so it should be recording now. Yeah, so it should be working. Okay, so it seems like most of you, or all of you that is, have definitely played before. However, I'm going to just start with a little bit of review how the pieces move, just so we don't have any misconceptions and everyone knows what's going on. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. You should be able to see it in just a second. Okay, so you should be able to see just an empty board here with just this one pawn on it. Okay, so I'm just going to start with how the pieces move. Okay, so first up we have the pawn. This is there. You start with 8 of them, right? So they're probably one of the first things you're going to be moving. So in real life, if you have an actual pawn, if you look at my camera, it should look something like this. It's kind of smaller, and you can see the resemblance between the piece they have on there and what I'm holding in my hand right now. So the pawn. So it's very simple. Okay, so I started with the simplest. It moves forward. It can move forward 1 square or 2 squares. So since it's on its first move, it can move 2 squares forward or 1 square forward. However, if it was anywhere else, it would only be able to move 1 square. And the pawn is different from the other pieces in that it does not capture forward. So if there was a piece on this square right in front of the white pawn, which is moving this way, if there was a piece on this square right in front of it, white would not be able to capture it. That would not be allowed. The pawn captures diagonally. So if there were a piece on this square or this square, the white pawn would be able to capture it, but not forward. So it is unique in that aspect, and all other pieces capture the same way that they move. So this should be a bit of a review, obviously. Okay, so we're going to move on to the rook. Okay, so the rook is, if it would load, okay. The rook is the piece that looks like the castle, which is actually not what it's called because that term is used to refer to something else. So the rook, if you look at my camera, it looks like this. Obviously, you can again see the resemblance. Okay, so the rook moves in a straight line, in vertically or horizontally, but not through pieces, obviously. So the rook in this position can move, so it can move to any of these squares that I'm highlighting, right, up and down, or the rook on d4 could also move to any of these squares, side to side, but not through pieces. Okay, so the rook is indeed very simple, so we're going to get slightly more complicated, but not really, to the bishop. So the bishop, it looks, I have one here. It looks like this. Okay, you can, it looks pretty similar to the little figure that the computer likes to put on there. So it's also very simple. It moves diagonally, as many of you will know. So one thing to note is that a bishop on a dark square, you'll notice that some of the squares are dark and some of the squares are light. The bishop on a dark square, like this one is, can only move to dark squares for the entire game just by its nature and how it moves. So the bishop can move diagonally in these directions, right? Okay, so obviously to any of these squares, but not through pieces. So for example, if black had a piece on this square, the bishop would not be able to move to jump over it and go over here, for example. Okay. So I know I'm going a bit quickly, but it just seems that most of you should already know how most of these pieces move. But if you don't, that's obviously fine as well. So the next piece is probably the one you may have heard of the most acclaimed one. Is the queen. It looks like this. It has a little crown on top there. So it's I like to think of it as the rook plus the bishop, which is exactly what it is actually. So it can move. It's very powerful. It can move just like a rook. Okay, you'll remember when we talked about the rook, this is where we said it could move. But it also has the option of moving like a bishop. Right, so the queen could go almost, they tell you can go anywhere, but obviously that's not entirely true. It can go horizontally or vertically or diagonally, which makes it the most powerful of all the pieces. Okay, and you only get one of them for this reason. All right, so moving on to the king. So it looks like this. In normal chess sets, it's the tallest one, generally about 3 inches tall. I'm holding one up right here. So it's the one that has usually a little point on top, as opposed to the little crown that the queen wears. So the king, you'll remember that I said the queen can move as far as she wants in any direction. The king is a similar concept, but it can only move one square in any direction. So the king could, on this square, could go to any of these squares, any of basically the surrounding squares. However, the king is the most important piece. You'll probably know that, in that you can't lose it. Okay, so the king is kind of your most important piece. You want to protect it, right? So if another person attacks your king, so for example, if the other person had a rook on this square, it would be attacking the king. You must save your king by the rules of the game. You cannot make any other move. You need to make a move that saves your king, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that in a few moments. Okay, so that's called being in check, right? So when the king is attacked, you are in check. When you attack the other person's king, you are checking them. Okay. Obviously, many people think the goal of the game is to capture the king. That's not entirely true, but it's very close. So we will also be talking about that. But yes, the king has a very limited mobility, and for that reason must be protected. All right, so now to the most complicated piece, the last one. There are only 6. Many young beginners like to call it the horsey. However, that is not the technical name for it. So it does look like a horse. If you look, I have one in my hand right now. But it's actually called the knight. Most of you should know this. The knight moves. They like to teach beginners that the knight moves in an L shape, a capital L, that is. So it could move basically side to side and then up or down, meaning it could go here or here. You'll notice that, so for example, if the knight chooses to go down and sideways, it makes a little L. Like I've sort of drawn an L with the arrows, and indeed this is one of the squares that the knight could jump to. So for the first interactive portion, does anyone want to call out? So you'll notice that there are coordinates along the bottom here. It says like A, B, C, D. Can you guys see that? Okay. And you'll notice that along the right side here, it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay. So those are like the coordinates. So if I were to go to the square that's H1, that would be this one. Okay. So does anyone, knowing how the knight moves, does anyone want to call out a square that the knight can move to? There are actually 8 of them in this scenario. So take your time. If you're wrong, obviously, I just introduced it, but just anyone to call out one square that the knight can move to here.
B3.
Sorry, which one?
B3.
B3. Okay, that's correct. Okay, so that's in an L shape this way. So B3 is one of the squares that the knight can move to. It could also go close to the same direction to B5, right? Anyone? F5. F5, that's right. So then I can move here. Anyone else with another square?
C2.
That's not already highlighted. C2, okay, that's correct. Knight to C2. Okay, anybody else? We're halfway there. So there are 8 total, and we've highlighted 4.
E6.
Okay. E6, that's correct. E6 to this square.
F3.
Up and over. Oh, I'm sorry. I deleted the highlights. F3, yes, that's 1. Okay, so there are 2 more. E2, which is this one, and C6. Okay. So you'll notice that the knight on the dark square, as it is right now, can only move to light squares just by virtue of how the knight moves. So these are all the squares that the knight can move to in this position. So that is it for how the pieces move. Does that make sense to everyone? Do you have any questions? There are some special moves that we'll be going over a little bit later that are slightly more complicated, but not too challenging. I see you're holding something up there. I can't quite read that.
My dad made he made like a paper that showed how all of the pieces move.
Oh, well, that's nice. That makes yeah, I can see it. It seems to that seems to do the job pretty well. but everyone understands this, right? Like most of you said you had played with your families before, so this is probably something you would know. Speak now or forever hold your peace, I guess. I'm probably not going to go over this again. All right, so I mentioned before that the king, okay, so this is just an example position. On this online program, when the king is in check, it appears red around it. So you'll notice that in this position, if you're playing the white pieces, black's bishop is checking your king, okay? So remember I said you have to get out of check. So for example, I could not give a check to black here. This move is not allowed because my king would be taken. I can't have that happen, right? So there are 3 ways in general to get out of check. So the first one would be to take the piece that's giving check, obviously, because then it would no longer be attacking your king. So in this position, the way white would do that is to play knight takes bishop, and white's no longer in check, obviously, because black's bishop that was giving check is no longer there. Okay. So the second option you have is to block the check, so you won't be able to do this if you're in check by a knight, but so for example, in this position, if you could put a piece here or here, the king would no longer be in check because the bishop would not be able to take the king through that piece. So in this scenario, white would play e3 if he wants to block the check. That is pawn to e3. And you'll notice that the bishop would not be able to take the king here, and white's king is no longer in danger. So the final way to block the check is kind of the most intuitive, simply just to move your king out of the way. So in this case, the king can move to any of these squares. For example, say this one. And he's out of check. So those are the 3 different ways you can get out of check. Whenever you're in check, you always need to get out of it. This is often a problem that people have when they're playing over a real board. However, since this class has to be over Zoom, we're doing an online program that makes you get out of check. Obviously, it doesn't let you play any moves that you're not allowed to. So we've been over all of that. The object of the game is checkmate. Obviously, they call it checkmate because the king is in check, but the king doesn't have a way to get out of check. So if you give checkmate to your opponent, you check their king, and they can't get out of it, you win. All right? So in this position, you'll notice black's king has a little red. It's highlighted in red there because it's in check, right? So remember we talked about the 3 ways to get out of check. So the thing here is black doesn't have any pieces with which to take white's rook that's giving check. Doesn't have any pieces to block the check on one of these squares, and doesn't have anywhere to move his king. White's king takes away these 3 escape squares, and the other two are taken by white's rook. So in this position, black is in checkmate and white has won the game. This is when you're checkmating with a rook. This is a very common pattern that you use to finish the game. Okay, so now I have a little puzzle. Okay, so this is just a sample position that I just made up. Something like this might actually occur. This seems like a pretty common thing. So white, in this position, chooses to get his queen out, unveils a little bit of a threat. You might see it. Some of you might not. Okay, so meaning if black were to just do the same thing, someone call out black has just made a fatal error and should now lose the game. So what does white do to win the game here? If anyone sees it, they can call it out. Okay, so in this position, I'll give you a hint. White only has 1 check, and that check is indeed checkmate. So if you see that check, you found the solution. Okay, so white's move here, if you didn't see it, white's move here is queen takes h7, and this is actually checkmate. Okay, so you'll notice that the queen checks the king. All right, the queen gives check to the black king, so black needs some way to get out of this. The first thing you'll notice is that if black's king were to try to take the queen, that's a big no-no because of white's bishop hiding all the way over here on the other side of the board. White's bishop would take the black king diagonally, so that's obviously not allowed. Black can't do that, not even an option. And Okay, so we know that black is not obviously going to be able to block the check because the queen is right next to the king. There's not even a square he would be able to put a piece on. None of black's pieces can take white's queen, right? This rook is a little too far. This knight can't get over there, and the pawns attack diagonally. So they wouldn't be able to take white's queen. And therefore, black is in checkmate. Black lost the game. This is a very common pattern you'll see in a lot of beginner games. They end like this. One person will make a level threat like this, and the other person won't recognize the problem. Okay, so does that make sense? The concept of checkmate, we all understand that. Sometimes it's a little hard to tell when you're in checkmate. It might take you a few seconds just to think like, okay, can my king move anywhere? Can I take their piece? Okay, so I will assume that makes sense. If you ever played a game of chess, it's probably ended in checkmate or...
Go to right start. Okay. Go to right start.
Okay, so
And can I have some more?
Sorry?
Both of you start talking loud.
Okay, if there's some noise in the background, if you would mind muting yourself like she said in the beginning, that would be preferable. Okay, thank you. So, all right, now we will move on to a concept that is, so if you'll notice over here on the left-hand side where my mouse is, these chapters in the beginning when I just spoke about the pieces. So the pieces we assign them sort of a number value based on the pawn being worth 1, and then we sort of assign the pieces a value based on that. Just as a general concept, it is possible to win the game when you have less pieces than your opponent or your pieces are worth less, but it's much harder, right? So if you just give away your pieces to your opponent for free all game, they're going to have a very easy time winning the game, and you don't want that. So it's important to, if you see your opponent give you a free piece, this is how many of your games will go in the beginning stages. If you see your opponent giving you a free piece, it's very important to be able to take it, right? So if we say that the pawn is worth 1 sort of point, we use the word material to describe the pieces that you have on the board. So if a pawn is worth 1 point of material, we assign that a bishop and a knight are worth 3 of those. So for example, if you have 3 pawns and the other person has an extra bishop or knight, that would be about equal because the pawn is worth 1 and the bishop and the knight are worth 3. Does this make sense? I hope it does. So the rook being slightly more valuable, the rook has a value of 5, right? So if you have, for example, a bishop and 2 pawns, you'll remember that the bishop is worth 3 and we assign the pawns to be each worth 1. That is about the same value as a rook. And we can make conversions like this all day given the numbers that we assign the pieces. So, and finally, the queen, we assign a value of 9. Okay, so the queen is worth 9 pawns, which obviously you don't have on the board. So you start with 8. So for example, the queen would be worth 9. So if you have 2 knights and 1 bishop, so those are all worth 3. 3 plus 3 plus 3 is 9. So they would be approximately worth a queen, right? So if you can remember these numbers, they might help you in the middle of the game thinking, should I give away this piece for my opponent's other piece? You just think, well, which one is more valuable? Do I want to give away my rook for their bishop? The answer would be no. The one piece that we don't assign sort of a point value to would be the king, because you can't give away your king anyway. You can try, but you wouldn't be allowed to, and both sides always have a king, so it sort of doesn't really make sense to assign a value to it. In a way, you might think of the king as worth an infinite amount of points, right? So, okay, so does that sort of the conversion make sense? If you have any questions at any point, you can just call them out. So does that make some sense? If you could, like, I don't know, nod or just Leah. Okay, so if that makes sense, we can move on to we can move on to a different topic. So this is just a position I like to show to give some sense. Just because two pieces are worth the same amount, like points-wise, this is just sort of a system we made up to help decide when you should give up your pieces or not. Just because the pieces are worth the same, like points-wise, doesn't mean that they're actually the same strength, which can be kind of confusing, but hopefully it makes sense. So in this position, white's knight is in the middle of the board. Okay, so you always want your pieces to be in the middle of the board for this exact reason. Pieces in the middle of the board control more squares, the knight being a prime example. They simply control more squares, right? So you'll notice we already talked about this position with the knight. It controls 8 squares in the middle of the board. You guys called them out. Whereas black's knight, which is terrible, on the corner of the board only controls 2, right? So it controls 1/4 of the squares that white's knight does, even though the pieces are theoretically worth the same value. So this is just sort of an illustration that in the beginning of the game, it's very important to control the center of the board because those are the squares that your pieces are better placed on. And if you can put your pieces on better squares, your position should theoretically be better. Your pieces control more squares, and it's easier for your opponents to mess up or go wrong or accidentally give you one of their pieces. And then from there, it would be easier to give checkmate and win the game. Somebody's in the waiting room. I guess I should admit. I hope that worked. Okay, so at the beginning of the game, then we're going to talk about this. So this is the starting position. When you start a game online, it's going to give you the correct starting position, obviously, but there are a few things that you should know about setting up the game. There are a few things, like if you ever see them play chess in movies or TV shows, often they'll set it up wrong, and it's just inaccurate. So you want to be able to, when you play someone in real life, you want to be able to set up the board correctly. Okay, so there are a few things to notice. The pawns go in front, right? Black's pawns are also in front. Okay. The positions are totally symmetrical, so white's pieces are in the same setup as black's pieces, all right? The rooks are on the outside, followed by the knights, and then the bishops. Often people will mix up. They'll put the knights where the bishops are supposed to go and the bishops where the knights are supposed to go, but the knights are supposed to go closer to the rooks as shown here. The knights being these guys. So knights and then bishops, and then in the middle of the board, the king and the queen go. This is the most common mistake that I see when people are trying to set up the board. I see them, they would put the king here on D1, and they would put the queen on E1. This is white's king, by the way. Some people have trouble with that. These are the kings, and these are the queens. So some people switch the king and queen by accident, but so the way they're set up here is correct. The way you can remember that is the queen, white's queen is supposed to be on a white square. You'll notice the square that white's queen on is indeed white, and black's queen is supposed to be on a dark square. The queen that the square that black's queen on is dark. Okay, so that's just a simple way, white on white and the darker color queen on the darker color square. That makes sense. And so the only other thing is, if you can imagine a physical board that has the alternating squares on, if you were to turn it, then this would be the bottom right. So you always need to make sure that you're playing with the bottom right square for either player is a light square. In this case, that's the square that this rook is on, and it is a light square. So if the bottom right is white, that's a little mnemonic that they like to tell kids, and the queen is on their color, then the board is set up correctly. That's just a little message I like to throw in there. Online, obviously, it's not a big deal because they set it up for you. So at the beginning of the game, I said that it was important to try to control the middle of the board. So often, what beginners do is what I'm going to show black doing here, and what more experienced players do, and players who've been playing for a long time, is what I'll show white doing here. Okay, so white, you'll notice none of white's pieces can move, obviously. Well, the knights can. Often, white players move the knights to start, but more often they move a pawn to start, okay? So if you've ever played, you've played your family, most of you said you have, you've probably seen them start out with this move. This is E4, E4. It's the most common starting move for white, and for good reason, because it controls this central square, which, as I said, was very important, control the center. And it also makes room for white's pieces to go out, right? This bishop now has a diagonal it can move on, so can this queen. And if white's feeling a little risky, they can bring their king out, but obviously that's not going to be a good idea. So black should do the same thing. He should play something like move his pawn here or move his pawn here to control this square. Okay, but instead he chooses a terrible move in this position, h6. It doesn't really make much sense, so this kind of shows that black doesn't really have much experience, or is just, you know, trying to be a little silly. So this pawn move does control this square, but that's not a very important square given that it's on the side of the board, and it doesn't help any of his pieces get out. Okay. So white just continues controlling the center. Now white has all 4 central squares under control. If your opponent lets you, a general rule of thumb in the opening is if your opponent lets you make this formation with your pawns, you should do it, because you're controlling a lot of the center, and it makes it very hard for black to try to control the center. So now if black were to strike, white could simply take. And black just gave away one of their pawns for free, which is something you don't want to do. So black continues playing badly. This still doesn't really make any sense, right? Black's just controlling these squares that don't really matter. Moving pawns on the side of the board. White brings his knight out, right? This is a very aggressive square for his knight. Okay, controls the middle. Black keeps kind of doing nothing. White brings his other knight out. His or her other knight out, that is. White brings their other knight out. Controlling the d5 and e4 squares, as highlighted. So now white has a very strong control of the center, whereas black doesn't really have any good squares to put his pieces on, because anywhere he puts his pieces, like let's say he tries to control the center, he's going to get kicked away, right? Now white is attacking black's knight, black's going to have to move it, and white has gained even more space in the center. So black is already having a super hard time here, and it's only move, 4? White has only made 4 moves. Okay, so black just continues. White brings his bishop out, eyes this sensitive square near black's king. You'll notice the only piece that protects this pawn is black's king. So white eyes it with his bishop while still controlling the center, getting his pieces out. This is really what you want to do in the opening. Okay, so finally, black gets one of his pieces out. It's very important to get your pieces out because, you know, if your pieces sit back here the whole game, they don't really do anything, right? You can't just win the game by moving your pawns. You have to move your pieces. And so you want to make sure that you use all of them. So black finally does that, but this isn't a very good square, right? Because he's moved his knight to the side of the board. And remember when we looked, the knight in the corner of the board didn't have many good squares, and this is the same idea. Black's knight doesn't really control any of the important squares. White has sort of a hammerlock on the center, and black's knight only controls these squares that are not important. So white kind of does the same thing. So now he has a dream position. This is kind of a setup to remember. If your opponents, black makes another bad move. If your opponents don't contest you in the center, this is pretty much what you want to do. So white has a very good position, and so white has already. We've seen white control the center. First, he moved his pawn, so that's the first thing you need to do. You're probably going to need to move some of your pawns, and then white controlled the center with his pieces. So that's the second thing to do, is get your pieces out, and now white's looking for a way to make sure that out of the opening, which is just what we call the beginning of the game, the opening, his king is safe. So right now, white's king is in the middle two, well, they're columns, but we call them files in chess for whatever reason. And he wants to probably be more safe, so he preferred to be on one of these squares, right? So where he's out of the danger in the middle of the board that can happen. Obviously, black here isn't very poised to attack white, but white still wants to make sure his king's safe. So and he wants to. You'll notice white's rooks still don't really do anything. They control white's h1 rook controls these 2 squares, and white's a1 rook on the a1 square controls these 2 squares. So they don't really do much. So in one move, there's a very special move called castling. You've probably heard of it if you've played in your families, as you said you have. or even if you haven't, you're about to. So there's a very special move white can play where he moves his king out of danger, which is a big plus, and he also gets his rook in, which is another plus. So I'm going to I'm just going to take all the pieces off the board for a second. So to castle, there are two ways to castle, but the move is called castling, which is also coincidentally why we don't refer to the rook as the castle, because that just gets very confusing. So there's castling kingside, which is this way. In white's case, it's castling right, but you don't call it that because if you're playing black, that would obviously be to their left. Where white's king moves 2 spaces over here, and black's rook moves next to it. All right. So that would look like this. And that's one move that white can play. And often in the opening, it's a very, very good idea. Every top players, you'll see them do this every game, simply because it gets their king safe and it's very helpful so they don't lose the game quickly. The other way to castle would be with this rook, the rook that's on your queen's side. You'll remember white's queen started here. And so this is the side of the board that white's queen was on. It's also called castling long because you'll notice that there's more space over here. There are 3 squares. All over here, there are only 2 between the king and the rook. So that would simply be like this. White's king moves 2 squares toward the queen's side, and the rook comes in. Okay. So either way, it's a good idea. You'll notice white's rook is now in the center of the board, and his king is a little safer. So if we were to go back to this position that we just saw, a very good move here for white might be to either get his king out of the center, like this, move his queen first, or move his queen first. If black continues badly, castle queenside, right? So now white's king is out of center, his rook is in the game, and white has a very picturesque position here. His king is safe. Both rooks are in the center of the board, so they'll be doing things. The knights, bishops, pawns all control the center of the board. White has an amazing position. This is really what you want to do in the opening. However, not all of your opponents are going to do nothing, especially if you play someone who has also taken this class, and I just explained the same thing that I explained to you. Okay, so here is a sample game that might actually happen, and then after this, if we have volunteers, you can play. Play preferably each other, given what you've learned. Okay, so white starts out the same way, but instead of letting white get this huge pawn mass in the center, black chooses to strike back. Okay, so black's basically doing the same thing. He's controlling squares, and he's ready to get his pieces out. White brings his knight out. This is a very good move, attacking black's pawn. So if the idea is that if black does nothing, wastes a move, white might be able to chomp on black's pawn there, and then white would simply have an extra pawn. You'll notice here black has only 7, and oh, I'm very sorry for that. And white has all 8 of his original pawns that he started with. So here white would be up a pawn, and that's just much better. Okay, so black gets a piece out and defends the pawn. All right, so this knight, now if white were to take the pawn, black would take back. And you'll remember, so white has gained 1 pawn in the middle of the board, but black took white's knight. Okay, so remember, a pawn was worth 1 and a knight was worth 3. Knights are worth more than pawns. White just gave up a knight and only gained black's pawn for it. So that would be very bad for white. So since white could go here, we'll just examine white. We'll examine white, bring his knight out, defending his pawn in the center. Black does the same. These are very common squares for the knights to go to. Almost always you'll see the knights go here because they control squares in the middle of the board that are very important. So white gets his bishop out, eyes this sensitive square. Black could do the same, but black, say, in this scenario, has a different idea. Maybe he goes here. Okay, so you'll notice black's knight is attacking this pawn. White's knight defends that pawn. Okay, if black were to take immediately, obviously white would take back, and black would have given up a knight for white's pawn, which is not good. All right. black has the idea, maybe if white does nothing, this is sort of a slightly more advanced idea, maybe black will take the knight. White doesn't want to just have given black a knight, so white takes black's bishop back in a way that gets his own bishop out. And maybe black would want to take this pawn. So here black would be up a pawn. This doesn't actually work for a reason that's slightly complicated, so I'm not going to go into it, but that's just black's general idea. He's going to put pressure on white's center in the middle of the board. So white gets this bishop out. Now this bishop has a way to move out. And you'll notice white's bishop isn't here anymore. If it was here, white moving this pawn would block his bishop. However, white's bishop is out here, and it's very good. And now white chooses to push his pawn to d3 and can get his dark squared bishop out, which would be this one. Also, this pawn supports the center. Black chooses to castle. Good idea. White chooses to castle. So far, white and black both have controlled the center with their pawns, as well as their pieces. Okay? So black chooses to sort of copy white. White gets another piece out, eyes the center of the board. Black does the same. White moves his queen. You'll notice white waited a while to move his queen. A thing they tell beginners is don't move your queen out early in the game, because often you'll just overlook the fact that your opponent can take it, and then you'll have lost your most important piece very early, and that just puts you at a huge disadvantage. Okay, so white waits a while. His queen is very safe here. Black moves his rook out. White gets his rook in the middle of the board. So white has done everything you're supposed to do in the opening, and so has black. Here, black might make an error and say, look, I'm going to attack your bishop with my pawn. So one thing you often like to do before examining things like this is look how many white pieces are controlling this square. 1, 2, 3. This knight, this bishop, and this pawn. Okay. Black, meanwhile, only has one piece controlling that square, which is this knight. So when he moves his pawn here, white can simply take. Well, he has three ways of taking here, actually. You wouldn't like to take with the pawn, simply because you don't like your two pawns to be like this, like on the same column, because they can't defend each other that way, and you're giving up control of the center. White chooses to take with his knight, which is the best move in this position. So right now, white, let's go back a bit. White just took black's pawn. So white simply has an extra pawn in this position. If black takes white's knight, white simply takes back and retain his advantage of one pawn. If you count, black has 7, white has 8. All other pieces being the same, that means white has a better position because black has made a bad move and given away his pawn. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information. Did all of that make sense? Did anybody have any questions? You can just call them out if you like. Any questions about basically anything that I just said? Chess in general, before we move on? No? Okay, so now is the time at the end of the class when, if we have any volunteers, you guys can play each other. Okay, so does anybody want to play right now? Okay, so Katie is raising her hand. Anybody else?
I will.
You will? Who said that? I'm sorry.
Sam Solari.
Sam. Ah, yes. Okay. All right. So you were asked. You should have received an email to make an account on this website. Did you guys do that, Katie and Sam?
I'm pretty sure on.
Okay. If you could remember. Okay. You said yes. So what did you make your username?
I'm Katie Cat.
Katie. Sorry. Back. Can't type. How do you CAT at the end?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is okay. So I'm just going to make sure that I'm going to be able to watch the game. That's what I just did. And Sam, you said you made an account too. Is that correct?
I'm pretty sure. Let me check.
Okay. Yeah. If you could check on that, and then what you guys are going to do is maybe mute your computer so you can't hear me. I'm going to be talking while you play. Just talking about the game. Don't worry, I'm not going to be mean to you or anything. Just to try to be instructive for the rest of the people in the class. And so yeah, you would mute the two people who are playing would mute, like simply mute your computer so you can't hear me talking while you play is what you would do. And preferably also maybe mute yourselves if you'd like to during the games just so you can focus. So Sam, if you can just let me know what your username is when you check, that would be very helpful
All
at
right.
any point. Thank you.
Nobody turned it off. Turn it on.
I cannot find my account.
You can't find your account. Okay, that's not good. Does somebody, if you want to either make an account quickly or if somebody else wants to play, do we have any other volunteers?
Wait, what is the name of the website?
Okay, so that's lichess.org. If you just type that into your browser, I think you can see this up here. It'd be that. Do you not remember what your account is? Is that what happened, or?
No, I can't. It won't work anymore.
It won't work. Okay, that's not good. If it's okay with you, I'm going to have somebody else play just simply for the sake of time. Thank you. Mason, you look like you want to play, right? If you could unmute yourself and tell me what your username is.
Do you have a username?
Yes.
Why are you not playing there?
Because it's not. Because it's not. We're not going to do it here.
Okay. Mason, are you there? That's not good. You're there, right? Could you do me a favor and unmute yourself? It's in the bottom left, just so I can hear you when you talk.
Sorry, I lost my cursor. My mom's computer is old, and sometimes the
Okay.
cursor goes missing.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
My username is Mason Colley, no space.
Mason, how do you spell? How do you spell the last name?
C-A-U-L-E-Y.
C-A-U. Okay, thank you. All right, so now this website is not very. I'm going to I'm going to keep sharing my screen. You can basically just ignore my screen for right now. Maybe I'll. Okay, this is just a chess position, just a random one. So if you two want to play each other, what you'll do is, are you both on the website right now?
Yep.
Okay, so if you go, sorry, I believe it should be play a friend on the right-hand side. I can show you mine if that would help you.
Yeah.
It'd be this button, play a friend, and then so one of you can create this, or maybe Katie if you want to do it. I just picked one of you.
Wait.
Yeah.
Wait, how do I go in?
How do you go in?
Yeah.
So you see this? Do you see this URL that's on the top of my page?
No.
Oh, can you guys not see that? Okay, well it's right here in the top left too.
So I press.
So you would go to play with a friend if you're signed in.
I hovered my cursor over play, and then it said create a game. Is that what I want?
You were on a computer, correct?
Yes.
On the website. Okay, so go to play with a friend. Do you see that?
No.
Uh-oh. Okay, so we could save this for next time if you guys prefer, or we could try it now. I don't.
Why don't we just try clicking create a game?
Okay, because the problem is if you click create a game, you're going to play someone random. That's the thing. Okay, so we can we can simply do this next time. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for the moment.
I see it. I found it.
You see it? Okay.
Yes, I found it.
I think we're just going to do this next time because I just realized we're running out of time and I don't want to I don't want to take you too far past the hour. Obviously, on this website, you can play anyone during this week. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for the moment. Okay, so I hope you have learned something today. That would be very good. So before next week, sorry, I actually am going to go back to sharing my screen. Can't really make up my mind here. Okay. If you'll notice, this is the website that you were asked to create an account on. So these, if you'll notice, there are tabs in the top right here. So there are a few, or the top left, that is. There are a few things that it's not exactly homework, but if you want to try some of them before next week, that might be something that would be a good idea. So under Learn, there is Chess Basics. So if you were to click on that, you would be able to learn about the pieces here. So if I go into just the Rook, it'll help you if you can't remember how to move the pieces. Maybe try it. They have Rook, Bishop, Queen, King, etc. Right. Other things you could try to do are obviously playing a lot is good. If you look under Play, that's how you would play. Believe it or not. There is also if you go under Learn, there's Coordinates. So it would give me a square, in this case E7. I would click it. So this is just to learn where the squares are. So I can do this very fast. You will not be able to do this as fast, I assume. So that's one thing, just to learn where the squares are, which will make it a little easier for you to A, talk to people about chess, and B, if I were to say square, like D5, which is this one, it would be easier for you to recognize where that square is more quickly. When I see a square, I know exactly where it is because I've been playing for a very long time. So yeah, before next week, you can play other people. That's the best way to get better. Maybe learn the coordinates. And if you can't remember how the pieces move, this website has a Chess Basics thing that you might want to try. Okay. Before next game, I just stopped sharing my screen again. Next week. If you play a game online, and you want to have me look at it during the class, for everyone's benefit, I would be fully willing to do that. If you want to send me the game on this website, so you could probably get a link to the game. If you were to just save that somehow, and the next time, next week at 1 o'clock, you could put it in the chat, and then I would be able to look at it and provide some feedback. So that might help you get better. And maybe next time you can play against each other. So I hope you all have enjoyed. That will be the end for today. It is 1:57, unless you have questions. So I left a few minutes at the end here for questions. If any of you have them about chess, you raised your hand. Okay, so I assume that means you have a question. Kavi?
I didn't do that. I don't know how I accidentally did that.
Oh, okay. If that was an accident, that's not a problem. If anybody else has any questions about chess in general, something you've always wondered, a question about me, I don't know, just anything. That's what I left this 3 minutes at the end here for. All right, but if not, that is fine. If you want to come next week with questions, like you heard something during the week, that's obviously fine. I'll be taking questions at any point. Okay, so before next week, those were the things that you might want to try. Obviously, just playing is the best one. If you want to come in with a game, great. I hope you have enjoyed. I hope you've enjoyed today, and I will see you all next week, Tuesday, 1 o'clock. So, all right, I'm going to stop recording now.
Thank you so much. That was great.
You are welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope you enjoyed it.